smoke hung thick in the Blackwood saloon the night a man's life was traded for 3 queens. He wasn't betting gold, nor cattle, but a terrified woman trembling in the corner. Everyone called her a worthless burden, but they had no idea what she was hiding beneath her tattered shawl. Historical records from the Montana Territory in the winter of 1883 are mostly filled with mundane ledgers of silver yields and harsh winter survival rates. Yet, nestled within the archive journals of a Bannock saloonkeeper named Hiram Smith, lies an account so baffling it reads like prairie folklore. But the names are real, the town was real, and the poker game that shifted the destiny of 2 unlikely souls actually happened on the freezing evening of November 14th. Samuel Graves was not a man who frequented the low-lit, desperate corners of civilized settlements. He was a mountain man, in the truest sense, a towering, broad-shouldered trapper who spent his years entirely off the grid in the brutal altitudes of the Bitterroot Range. Covered in furs that smelled faintly of pine resin and wood smoke, his face was obscured by a thick, dark beard and shadowed by the wide brim of a worn Stetson. He only descended into Bannock twice a year to trade his pelts for coffee, flour, ammunition, and perhaps a single evening of whiskey before returning to his absolute solitude. On this particular night, a blizzard was threatening to lock the town in ice, forcing Samuel to wait out the storm inside Smith's saloon. To pass the hours, he sat at the far corner table, quietly nursing a glass of rye and sitting in on a game of 5-card draw. He was a methodical player, his face a slate of unreadable stone, which deeply unnerved the other men at the table. Across from him sat Caleb Dawson. Caleb was a notoriously bitter prospector whose luck had dried up alongside his mining claims. Sweating profusely despite the drafty room, his eyes darted with manic desperation. Caleb owed money to dangerous men back east, and his pockets were entirely empty. The center of the rough-hewn oak table was piled high with silver dollars, gold dust pouches, and paper deeds a pot worth nearly $600, a staggering fortune in those days. "I'll see you're 50, Samuel murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the din of the saloon. He tossed 2 gold coins into the pile. Caleb's hand shook as he looked at his cards. He had nothing left to bet. The veins in his neck strained against his grimy collar. The other players had folded, leaving only the mountain man and the desperate prospector. "I ain't folding, Graves," Caleb spat, his voice cracking. "I got the winning hand. I know I do." "Then match the bet," Samuel replied calmly, his ice blue eyes fixed on the man. Caleb frantically patted his empty pockets. Then his frantic gaze darted to the dark corner of the saloon near the hearth. Sitting there, huddled against the cold on a wooden stool, was a woman. She was wrapped in a threadbare wool shawl. Her head bowed so low her dark tangled hair obscured her face. This was Josephine Caleb's wife. To the town of Bannock, she was a ghost. Caleb paraded her around as a badge of his own misery, loudly complaining to anyone who would listen that she was a worthless, mute burden who couldn't cook, wouldn't speak, and was entirely useless on the frontier. "I have property," Caleb suddenly declared, slamming his hand on the table. He reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled, heavily stamped document. Under the Territorial Debt Acts, a man's dependents and their bonded labor can be transferred in lieu of hard currency. I have the marriage certificate and a signed writ of bonded servitude. I'm putting the woman in the pot. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the Blackwood saloon. Even the piano player in the corner abruptly halted his playing. The sheer depravity of the wager hung in the smoky air. "You're betting your wife, Dawson?" Hiram Smith asked from behind the bar, his rag pausing on the polished wood. "That ain't right. She's my legal property," Caleb barked, spittle flying from his lips. "She don't talk. She's a worthless stray I took pity on and sent. Louis, and she's eaten my rations for 2 years. I'm valuing her bond at $50. You call the bet graze, or you fold and the pot is mine." Samuel didn't blink. He slowly turned his massive head to look at the woman in the corner. Josephine hadn't screamed or protested. She simply sat there, clutching a battered leather valise to her chest as if her life depended on it. But as Samuel looked at her, she slowly lifted her head. Through the mess of dark hair, a pair of startlingly sharp, intelligent emerald eyes met his. There was terror in them, yes, but beneath the fear burned a fierce, unyielding fire. She was not broken. She was waiting. A deep revulsion churned in Samuel's gut. He despised the cruelty of men like Caleb. He didn't want a wife, and he certainly didn't want a companion in the high mountains. But he could not leave a human being to the mercy of a man who would trade her for gambling debts. "I call," Samuel said softly. Caleb barked a triumphant, hysterical laugh and slammed his cards down. "Full house, 8's full of 4s. Read 'em and weep, you mountain savage." Samuel stared at the cards. Then, with agonizing slowness, he flipped his own cards over one by one. The Queen of Spades, the Queen of Hearts, the Queen of Clubs, the Ace of Diamonds, the Ace of Spades. "3 queens," Samuel said softly, "and a pair of aces." The saloon erupted into a chaotic murmur. Caleb's face drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen gray. He staggered backward, his chair clattering loudly against the floorboards. No, that ain't possible. You cheated." Samuel stood up. He was 6'4", broad as a grizzly, and the heavy Colt revolver strapped to his thigh suddenly looked very prominent. "The pot is mine, Dawson. Leave the paper on the table." Caleb, trembling violently, looked around the room for support, but the other patrons simply stared back with hard, unsympathetic eyes. Cursing under his breath, he turned and stumbled out of the saloon, pushing through the swinging doors into the howling blizzard, leaving his entire life behind on the veldt. Samuel calmly scooped the coins and pouches into his canvas sack. He picked up the crumpled marriage certificate and debt bond, folding it neatly and slipping it into his coat pocket. Finally, he turned and walked over to the corner where Josephine sat. She flinched as his massive shadow fell over her, her knuckles turning white around the handle of her valise. "Get your things, ma'am," Samuel said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "We're leaving at first light." The journey out of Bannock the next morning was bitterly cold. Samuel had used a portion of his winnings to purchase a sturdy, sure-footed mule for Josephine, along with a thick bearskin cloak to shield her from the biting wind. As they rode out of town, the gossips and busybodies of Bannock watched them go from their frosted windows, whispering about the wild mountain man and the worthless wife he had won in a card game. The trail up into the Bitterroot Range was not for the faint of heart. It was a steep, treacherous ascent through dense forests of lodgepole pine and jagged granite ravines. Samuel rode ahead on his massive draft horse, leading Josephine's mule by a thick rope. For the first 2 days, neither of them spoke a single word. Josephine kept her face buried in the heavy fur collar of her new coat, her small hands constantly resting on the leather valise tied securely to her saddle horn. She fully expected Samuel to be just another iteration of Caleb, a brutal, demanding man who viewed her as property. She braced herself for the moment he would turn on her, demand her labor, or worse. But Samuel Graves was a man of the wild, and the wild demanded a quiet, respectful discipline. When they made camp in the snow-dusted clearings, he didn't bark orders at her. Instead, he efficiently gathered firewood, struck a blaze, and handed her a tin plate of hot beans and salt pork without demanding gratitude. When she timidly offered to wash the plates in the freezing creek, he silently took them from her hands and did it himself. "You'll freeze your fingers off, ma'am," was all he said. On the third evening, they finally breached the tree line and arrived at Samuel's cabin. It was a remarkable piece of frontier engineering, built directly into the side of a massive limestone cliff, sheltered from the worst of the alpine winds. Inside it was Spartan but incredibly clean. Cured pelts lined the floor, cast iron pots hung over a massive stone hearth, and a single large bed stuffed with dried moss and covered in thick quilts sat in the corner. Samuel lit the oil lamps, casting a warm golden glow over the rough-hewn timber walls. He turned to Josephine, who was standing awkwardly near the door, still clutching her valise. "Listen to me carefully, Mrs. Dawson," Samuel said, taking off his Stetson and running a hand through his Dason and running a hand through his dark hair. "I didn't play that hand to own you. I played it to get you away from a bad situation. This cabin is yours for the winter. You take the bed. I'll sleep on the floor near the hearth. Come the spring thaw, I'll take you to the railhead in Bozeman, and you can go wherever you please. You ain't my wife, and you ain't my servant." Josephine stared at him, her emerald eyes wide with absolute shock. For the first time since he had seen her in the saloon, her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but no sound came out. She simply nodded slowly, a profound sense of confusion warring with the immense relief washing over her. For the first month they lived in a strange, synchronized silence. Josephine, true to Caleb's complaints, did not speak a word. But contrary to her reputation as a worthless woman, she was anything but. As her fear of Samuel began to melt away, replaced by a cautious trust, she began to move around the cabin with quiet purpose. She learned to tend the fire, to mend his torn canvas gear with tiny, incredibly precise stitches, and to bake thick, hearty bread from his stores of flour. Yet she fiercely guarded her leather valise. She kept it locked with a small brass padlock, the key hidden somewhere on her person. Samuel, respecting her privacy, never asked about it. The turning point and the first glimpse into the dangerous secret she carried happened in late December during a brutal whiteout storm. Samuel had been outside trying to secure the roof of the woodshed when a rotted timber gave way. He stumbled back into the cabin, his face pale, clutching his left arm. A jagged piece of wood had sliced deep into his forearm, severing a vein. The bleeding was heavy, soaking through his thick wool sleeve. Samuel gritted his teeth, grabbing a dirty rag to tie off the wound. "Don't look, Josephine. It's a bad one." But Josephine didn't turn away. Instead, a startling transformation came over her. The timid, silent woman vanished. She rushed to the table, her hands moving with lightning speed as she unlocked her leather valise. She threw it open. Samuel, fighting off a wave of dizziness from the blood loss, forced his eyes open to see what was inside the bag. He expected trinkets, perhaps stolen money or letters. Instead, the valise was packed with shining silver surgical instruments, glass vials of clear liquid, tightly rolled bandages, and thick, leather-bound medical texts written in what looked like Latin. Before Samuel could protest, Josephine was at his side. She pushed him firmly into a chair with a strength that surprised him. Without a word, she poured a stinging liquid over the wound, produced a curved silver needle threaded with silk from her bag, and began to stitch his flesh back together with the rapid, flawless precision of a master surgeon. As she worked, she muttered under her breath, not in English, but in rapid, flawless French. Samuel stared at the woman he had won in the poker game, his heart pounding not from the injury, but from the sudden, terrifying realization. Josephine wasn't a worthless, mute prairie wife. She was a highly educated, wealthy woman hiding from someone or something so dangerous that she was willing to endure years of abuse in silence just to stay hidden. When she finished tying off the final stitch, she looked up, her breathing heavy, and finally met Samuel's stunned gaze. You're a doctor," Samuel whispered hoarsely. Josephine wiped the blood from her hands, her emerald eyes hardening into a look of absolute steel. She finally spoke, her voice smooth, aristocratic, and trembling with a dark, heavy past. "My name is not Josephine, Mr. Graves, and if the men who are looking for me find out I am alive, they will burn this mountain to the ground with both of us on it. My true name is Dr. Catherine Moreau," she said, the aristocratic cadence of her voice ringing with a sharp, metallic clarity in the quiet cabin. "And until an hour ago, I believed that maintaining my silence was the only thing keeping a bullet out of my skull." Samuel stared at her, the throbbing pain in his stitched arm momentarily forgotten. The timid, broken creature from the Blackwood saloon was entirely gone, replaced by a woman radiating a formidable heart and intelligence. Catherine moved back to the table, systematically wiping down her silver instruments with a cloth soaked in alcohol. "I was the personal physician to Elias Rutherford, a highly prominent railroad magnate in Chicago. It was an unorthodox position for a woman, but Elias was a progressive man who valued competence over societal norms. 6 months ago, Elias died. The local coroner, a man entirely in the pocket of Elias' ruthless son, Rowan, ruled it a sudden failure of the heart." She paused, her emerald eyes narrowing as she looked into the roaring fire. "I knew Elias's health intimately. His heart was as strong as a draft horse's. I accessed the morgue in the dead of night and performed my own autopsy. I found distinct traces of aconite wolfsbane in his stomach lining. Rowan had poisoned his own father to seize control of the Rutherford Railroad empire before Elias could finalize a new will giving his fortunes to philanthropic trusts." Samuel slowly leaned back against the heavy timber wall, processing the sheer magnitude of her words. "And Rowan found out you knew. He caught me leaving the morgue," Catherine confirmed, her voice dipping into a lower, colder register. "He sent his private enforcers, ruthless men, who operate far outside the law, to silence me. I barely escaped Chicago with my life, my medical valise, and the tissue samples proving the murder. I needed to disappear into the vastness of the West. I made it to St. Louis and found Caleb Dawson in a gutter. I paid him $300 to act as my husband, to take me to the coast where I could board a ship to London. The agreement was simple. I play the mute, obedient wife, and he provides the cover of a married pioneer couple. But Caleb was a degenerate gambler. He drank away my passage money, dragged me up to the Montana Territory hoping to strike gold. And when he failed, he wagered the last thing of value he had me." A heavy silence descended upon the cabin, broken only by the crackle of burning pine. Samuel looked at the woman, realizing the staggering weight she had been carrying. She hadn't been cowering in that saloon out of weakness. She had been surviving, hiding in plain sight, playing a dangerous game of deception to stay alive. "You're safe here, Doc," Samuel finally rumbled, his voice low and steady. "The snows have blocked the pass. No one from Chicago or Bannock is getting up this mountain until the spring thaw. You have my word, that night marked a profound shift in the cabin. The imaginary wall between the mountain man and the fugitive doctor shattered." Catherine no longer hid in the corners. The next morning, Samuel awoke to find her dissecting a freshly caught mountain hare with surgical precision on the heavy oak table, preparing it for a stew. As the brutal Montana winter raged outside, burying the cabin under 10 feet of snow, a quiet, powerful bond forged between them. It was not a sweeping, theatrical romance born of poetry, but a deep, resonant partnership anchored in mutual respect and survival. Samuel taught Catherine how to read the tracks of wolves in the powder, how to skin a buck, and most importantly, how to handle a lever-action Winchester rifle. He found her to be a remarkably quick study. Her surgeon's hands were exceptionally steady, and she lacked any hesitation when it came to pulling the trigger. In return, Catherine filled the long, dark evenings with conversation. She spoke of medical breakthroughs, of bustling eastern cities, and of literature. Samuel, a man who had chosen the isolation of the mountains to escape the cruelty of the world, found himself mesmerized by her intellect. He began to look forward to the evenings by the hearth, watching the firelight dance across her face as she read from one of his few weathered books. By late February, the professional distance they had maintained began to dissolve into something much deeper. Samuel found his eyes lingering on the curve of her neck as she chopped firewood. Catherine found herself acutely aware of the rough, calloused warmth of his hands when they accidentally brushed against hers. When a late-season blizzard dropped the temperature to 40 below zero, freezing the moisture in the air itself, they abandoned the pretense of separate sleeping arrangements. They huddled together under the heavy furs on the moss-stuffed bed, sharing their body heat to survive the deadly freeze. In the pitch-black cold, surrounded by the howling wind, their shared physical warmth ignited a fierce, quiet passion. Samuel realized, with a jolt of quiet terror, that he was falling desperately in love with a woman who was destined to leave him. April arrived, bringing with it the deafening crack of melting ice and the rush of swollen rivers. The spring thaw was beautiful, but to Samuel and Catherine, it signaled the return of danger. The mountain was no longer an impenetrable fortress. Down in the muddy streets of Bannock, a stranger rode into town. He was dressed in an expensive charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place on the frontier, flanked by 3 heavily armed men in duster coats. His name was Cole Higgins, a former Pinkerton detective whose reputation for cruelty was legendary. Rowan Rutherford had paid him an exorbitant sum to track down the missing female physician and ensure the evidence she carried was buried with her. It didn't take Higgins long to find Caleb Dawson. The pathetic prospector was drunk in an alleyway behind the Blackwood Saloon. After a few minutes of agonizing persuasion involving a skinning knife, Caleb wept and confessed everything. He told Higgins about the poker game, the mountain man named Samuel Graves, and the trail leading up into the Bitterroot Range. On the morning of May 3rd, the scent of impending violence drifted up the mountain on the warming breeze. Samuel was chopping wood near the tree line when a flock of crows suddenly took flight from the valley below, cawing frantically. A lifetime of wilderness survival had honed Samuel's instincts to a razor's edge. He dropped his axe, sprinted back to the cabin, and bolted the heavy timber door. "Load the Winchester, Kate," Samuel barked, his eyes scanning the tree line through the small shuttered window. "We have company." Catherine didn't panic. Her face grew pale, but her hands were entirely steady as she grabbed the rifle from the mantel, sliding around into the chamber with a satisfying mechanical clack. She moved to the secondary window, positioning herself with military discipline. 4 riders emerged from the dense lodgepole pines, their horses struggling through the remaining slush. Higgins sat at the front, a smug, predatory grin on his face. He didn't bother with negotiations. He simply raised a hand, and his 3 mercenaries dismounted, drawing their revolvers and fanning out toward the cabin. "Graves," Higgins shouted, his voice echoing off the limestone cliffs. "Send the woman out with her bag, and we'll leave you to your furs. Keep her, and we'll burn you both alive." Samuel responded by kicking open the front shutter and firing his Sharps buffalo rifle. The massive .5 air slug tore through the chest of the mercenary closest to the porch, throwing the man backward into the mud like a discarded rag doll. Chaos erupted. Gunfire shattered the tranquil morning, bullets splintering the thick logs of the cabin. Samuel moved with terrifying speed, firing, reloading, and firing again, laying down a suppressing field of lead that kept Higgins and his remaining men pinned behind an outcropping of granite. But one of the mercenaries, a wiry man with a scattergun, had managed to flank the cabin during the initial volley. He kicked in the back door, shattering the wooden frame, and leveled his shotgun squarely at Samuel's back. Before the man could pull the double triggers, a deafening crack rang out from the corner of the room. The mercenary staggered sideways, dropping his weapon and clutching his throat. Catherine stood by the hearth, smoke curling from the barrel of the Winchester. She had shot the man cleanly through the carotid artery, a kill, shot born of both desperation and an intimate knowledge of human anatomy. Seeing two of his men dead in a matter of seconds, the remaining mercenary panicked and sprinted for his horse, abandoning his employer. Higgins, realizing the tactical disadvantage, tried to mount his own gelding to retreat. Samuel didn't give him the chance. Bursting through the front door, the mountain man tackled the bounty hunter off his horse, pinning him to the muddy ground with a heavy boot to his chest, the barrel of a cold revolver pressed firmly between his eyes. "Who sent you?" Samuel roared. Higgins spat a wad of bloody mud. "Rutherford, and he won't stop. He'll send an army." Catherine stepped out onto the porch, her valise gripped tightly in her hand. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, calculating resolve. She looked at Samuel, her eyes burning with a fierce light. "He's right, Samuel. If we stay here, we'll be looking over our shoulders for the rest of our lives." "I'm done running." Samuel holstered his weapon, hauling Higgins up by his collar and binding his hands with heavy rope. He looked at the woman he had won in a card game, realizing she was braver than any man he had ever known. "So what's the play, Doc?" "We don't go to the railhead," Catherine said, her voice ringing with finality. "We take this man, and we ride to Helena. There is a federal courthouse there. We hand over the tissue samples, the autopsy ledger, and this hired assassin to a federal judge. We bring the Rutherford empire down from the top." Samuel couldn't help but smile, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his rough face. He walked over, wrapping his massive arms around her, kissing her deeply amidst the gunpowder and the melting snow. "Pack your things, Mrs. Graves," he whispered against her hair. "We've got a long ride ahead of us." Historical records from the Montana Territorial Court in 1884 detail the sudden federal indictment of Chicago industrialist Rowan Rutherford, sparked by undeniable evidence presented by a doctor, Catherine Moreau. Shortly after the trial, a marriage certificate was filed in Helena. Samuel and Catherine Graves never returned to the East. They built a sprawling ranch in the Bitterroot Valley, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the darkest hands.